Drivers in Australia are facing more pain at the petrol bowser as crude oil prices hit a 7-year high. Escalating tensions between Ukraine and Russia is partly behind the price rises, combined with ongoing COVID supply chain disruptions. Let's bring in now live Peter Khoury from the NRMA. Peter, appreciate your time. Just how high are prices getting here in Australia, and what is the expectation as to just how high they might continue to rise?
Yeah, good afternoon. They are at record highs, and those record highs will unfortunately continue to rise. I mean, there's just really no good news for motorists. There hasn't been throughout any of 2022, and the forecast, unfortunately, isn't much better. The wholesale price in Australia is at record highs. We have now seen the highest ever average price, which was in Brisbane today at $1.92. Most other capital cities are in the 170s and going up. Regional Australia all paying higher than they've ever paid before, so just not good news.
And there is a huge gap, is there, between what people are paying in the cities and remote and regional areas? Is that gap widening at the moment, or is it situation normal there?
No, unfortunately, everyone's paying very high prices. So most regional towns that we've seen across Australia, certainly across New South Wales, are in the high 170s. And, those areas don't have price cycles. So, they won't get to the 180s and 190s, and we certainly hope not, that we expect to see in those cities that do have price cycles like Brisbane. But then obviously cities that have price cycles will come back down into the high 160s or the low 170s. But even then, the fact that we're talking about the low point of this cycle being in the 160s or low 170s, they're numbers that we never thought we'd see in Australia, and they're certainly numbers that we don't want to continue to see long term. But unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier, the factors that are pushing those prices up, well, they just don't look like they're going to go away.
Peter, we heard from Bob Katter last hour here on Sky News, and he was suggesting Australia's fuel reserves leave much to be desired. Are you confident we do have enough supply? We won't get into fuel shortage territory here with so much uncertainty overseas? Yeah,
well, they're two completely separate issues. So the emergency fuel that Australia holds is in the event that the nation just cannot get access to fuel, and therefore, like all other countries, we have to have a stockpile of emergency fuel. The majority of that would be diesel. We hold most of our emergency fuel is diesel because of that sort of scenario. Well, that's never happened before. So the issue here isn't that we can't get fuel. The issue is that it's just so expensive. Indeed, OPEC and other oil-producing countries have an increased supply to the levels that we want to see, but that is by choice. We are starting to see some other parts. Certainly, the United States has increased its crude production, and there is hope that maybe some sort of an agreement between the Iranians and the US will see more production come out of Iran. But, the fuel security issue, that's about keeping oil in stockpile, fuel in stockpile. If the ships stop arriving, well, they're arriving. The problem is they're just the fuel on the board those ships is so expensive, more expensive than we've ever seen before.
So all of this gets sorted out. What is the best tip for drivers who are wanting to find the lowest prices? Is there a good way in terms of going about that? Is there a certain day, a certain time? What's your best tip?
Well, the pain persists, unfortunately. There are things that motorists can do here in Australia, depending on where you live, to help you kind of steer away from the most expensive service stations. And, a good example is Sydney right now. The average is $1.77. We know that there are some service stations charging, upwards of $2 a litre, which is obviously significantly higher than the average. And there are a number of service stations still selling petrol in the 160s. And so in New South Wales, we have real-time data, which means that every service station in the state has to report their prices in real time. That information is then available to the community through the NRMA app, through the government's Fuel Check website, which means that it's a lot easier to find the cheapest petrol, even in these record high prices. We now have similar laws introduced in pretty much every jurisdiction except for Victoria and the ACT. So if you live in any of those states or territories outside of Victoria and the ACT, it is easier to find a bargain even in these record high prices. And so while we continue to find ourselves in this predicament, beyond the control of anything we can do in Australia, the best thing for motorists to do is do a little bit of research before you fill up because, as I said, averages are the highest we've ever seen, but there are still some service stations where they are, less than the average, and that's where we want our members and the community filling up.